Oh, and this one time at band camp. Oh, and this one time at band camp.
We did top hat last, right? Right before we left? We did genetic drift? Okay. Yeah. Oh my God, it's 9:30. Hello? Hello? Okay. All right. Okay. Yes. Okay, guys, do we have any questions from Tuesday? Right, we're talking about evidence for evolution. No? Anyone? Anyone? Okay. So another thing we're going to talk about for evidence for evolution is the idea of homology. Okay, homology amongst different species on this planet. So it can be any characteristic, right? Genetic, which would be by DNA, right? DNA sequence homology. Morphological, what they look like, something that looks developmentally, how something develops from the single fertilized egg into an embryo, into a fetus, into an offspring. And then the biogeographic is, again, where they came from. Okay. Anything that's shared by common descent, which means they had a recent common ancestor. Right? That idea that on their family tree, in the branch, there was somebody recently, which means in the last millions or so years, that they diverged from. Okay? Homology just means the same. Right? Homo means same, ology, the study of sameness. So DNA sequence sameness would be your DNA sequences between two species are very, very similar. Right? The more similar your DNA sequences are, the more related you are to that other organism. So we could do DNA sequence homology amongst the human species, and my DNA sequence will be most similar, as it turns out, to any of my siblings. Okay? Half of my DNA comes from my mom, and half of my DNA comes from my dad. So I'm 50% identical to my mother and 50% identical to my father. Okay? Half of your fathers, not all of it. Okay? But to your sibling also got half mom, half dad, some of the same halves, some different halves. Right? So siblings can be really close in DNA sequence, depending on if we got sort of the same halves, right? Or very different. You got completely different halves of that dad DNA and mom DNA. Okay? So if we look at DNA sequence between siblings, they're going to be really, really similar compared to like looking at a human being versus a chimpanzee, or you versus some other random person, right? But you still will be unique in your DNA sequence, right? That's what makes you you. The only people on this planet that are not unique by DNA are who? Identical twins. Identical twins were one sperm, one egg, got together, just like normal, and then at some point, when those cells started dividing and you make a ball of cells, those two split into two and became two separate individuals. Okay. They have the exact same DNA. They are clones of each other. Okay? The only differences would be changes in mutations that might have happened during development, and then environmental factors that can affect some genes are turned on and off. Right? So identical twins don't have to look exactly identical, but they're pretty darn close. Right? As you age, they end up looking a little more and more different. They have the exact same DNA. Okay? Fraternal twins that just happen to be in the uterus at the same time, right? 2 eggs and 2 sperms, 2 different eggs, 2 different sperms, right? Same as any other offspring, they just happen to be there at the same time. Right? They're no more similar to each other than a regular sibling that's 10 years apart, as long as they have the same 2 parents. Okay? You could look at morphological homology amongst siblings, right? Even if you're really pretty different, you might have at least one characteristic that's very similar, right? You both got your dad's nose, right? Or Grandma Edna's ears or something like that, right? You could be very similar. You may have inherited the same feature, same facial features, and that makes you look really similar, even though maybe all the other DNA you got in that random between mom and dad were totally different. Okay. Developmental, we all look exactly the same when we're a little embryo, okay, as human beings, right? As it turns out, we look incredibly like lots of other organisms on the planet. All the mammals, even the birds, all look extraordinarily similar as an embryo, even fish, as it turns out. And then biogeographic, like where you came from, where your ancestors came from, is likely you're going to be more similar to those people endemic to those areas than somebody else. Okay? And so you can do this stuff within a species, because then it's easier to understand what all these stupid terms mean. But generally, when we're looking at homology evolutionarily, we're looking at between species. Okay, so let's go through and give some examples. If we're looking at 4 different species, right, the turtle, right, which is a reptile, the platypus, which is a weirdo kind of mammal outgrouping, kangaroo, which is a marsupial, falls under the mammal-y but is weird too, and then a beaver, which is just your standard mammal. Okay. When I give these types of examples on the exam, I'm not going to make you know which animal is what type. Okay? Some animals I'm going to assume you know, like a giraffe, what a giraffe is. If for some reason I list an animal and you don't know what the hell that is, just raise your hand on the exam and ask me. Okay? I'll try not to use anything weird that falls under bizarre categories. But if I say lizard and you don't know that's a reptile, like, well, I don't know what a lizard, right, just ask. Because I don't want you to get it wrong because I listed an animal you're not familiar with, okay? This is just an example. And so if we were looking at homology, how similar these guys are to each other, we would start with something like they are all a vertebrate animal. They all have a spine, right? There are animals on this planet that don't have spines. What's an example of an animal that doesn't have a spine? A backbone. Yeah, a worm, a snail, starfish, sponge, jellyfish, right? All that kind of stuff. So we're more related to the organisms that have a spine than those that don't, okay, by homology, right? The vertebral column in all animals that have one is remarkably similar in structure and function. Okay, right? By common descent, the ancestor at some point that developed this spinal column gave them evolutionary advantage to survive and reproduce. Right? That's our ancestor. Right? We evolved from that forking. So this kind of tree, anytime there's a node or where it comes together, this was a recent ancestor, okay? And then, of course, the real tree goes on and on and on, and, you know, the jellyfish and all those guys are over here, and then bacteria are over here, right? But if we're just looking at the vertebrate, and then there's, you know, a ton more. These are just 4 examples, okay? So this would be the recent common ancestor that has a spine. okay, would be, right? That's how they're similar to each other. That's how we're deciding they're similar to each other in the most distant kind of way. Now, if you want to look at it, the recent ancestor for having hair and mammary glands, which is sort of the hallmark of being a mammal, right? At some point, from the common ancestor that had a spine, right, these guys diverged away from the reptiles. Reptiles do not have boobies, as it turns out, and they don't have fur. There's no hair, there's none of that stuff. Okay? So these guys took their own path during evolution, and it branched, blah, blah, blah. But the common ancestor that had hair and mammary glands, whatever that thing was, right, would sit right here, and then a divergence, a divergence, a divergence. Okay? So every place there's this sort of fork in the road is where there's an ancestor that then speciated. Right? Common ancestor that then speciated. Okay? So these guys are homologous to each other, or the same, because they all have hair and mammary glands. Right? A platypus does, kangaroo does, and a beaver does. But you believe me that turtles don't, right? Okay. I'm not lying, not this time. Okay. Now, if you speciate again, right? Because platypi, is that what you say? Platypuses? I don't know. Are not kangaroos, so they had to have diverged at some point, right? And so a divergence from this type, which are the monotremes, is in gestation, okay? If you don't know, platypus lays eggs. Huh? Right? It lays eggs like a chicken, okay? Kangaroos don't lay eggs. Beavers don't lay eggs, right? None of the other mammals lay eggs. We give birth to live young, okay? Right? Birds lay eggs. Turtles lay eggs, right? So that ancestor here that had hair and mammary glands, again, we had a divergence, laid eggs, right? Most lower organisms that are not as highly evolved lay eggs, like the reptiles, right, including birds and all those guys. So this guy sort of took that path, right, diverged into gestation, just means, you know, the developing offspring, right, that it was a survival and reproductive advantage to keep that embryo inside your body rather than laying it out in an egg. Okay? So both kangaroos and beavers, the regular mammals, right, give birth to live young. So their common ancestor would be at the next fork. So then if we looked at this, which of these four are the most similar to each other? We would say the guy with the most recent common ancestor, the one with the fork closest to them. So the kangaroo and the beaver are the most similar to each other of these four. Next would be the platypus. Then the turtle's the least similar to the rest of these. Okay? So anytime you're looking at any kind of tree like this, you can always tell me which is the least similar of the group. Right? That's the guy that comes off of a fork way down here. Right? The most similar are the ones who have the fork closest to them. Right? And then you can sort of count over. And in real trees, if you're listing a whole bunch of stuff, it gets totally crazy. But you can always do the most similar and the least. Right? Least is always that first branch. Most is always where that one last branch is. Okay. Oops, sorry. And so then the diversion here was the kangaroo and all the marsupials give birth to an embryo when it's very poorly developed, right? And that embryo climbs into a pouch and attaches to a mammary gland and drinks milk until it grows to a normal size. So it would be like during the first trimester giving birth to a baby and then sticking it in a pouch where it would just nurse then for another, 6 months, okay? Whereas the mammals keep it inside until it's essentially able to survive on its own with just mother's care, right? At the point of birth in a kangaroo, if it doesn't get into the pouch and attach to the mammary gland for a source of nutrition, it dies, like within an hour, right? Very, very unsustainable outside of the pouch, okay? Whereas in mammals, when they're born, they can survive. I mean, you have to feed them, but they're not going to die in an hour if they don't eat immediately, right? And they don't need to be connected to a nutrition source constantly, okay? So the pouch versus keeping them in there until they're enormous, which, as it turns out, bad idea, right? It would have been nicer had we gone to the pouch idea. Pouches are very stretchy, right? You can then have a 9-pound baby in a pouch without a problem. Sending a 9-pound baby, yeah, it's really bad. It's a bad idea. So yeah, we took the wrong turn evolutionarily. Okay, so here's another example, another tree. So again, we're going to talk about the primates, right? Our mammal ancestor somewhere down here. We're not even including the branches for the reptiles and all that kind of stuff, right? And how we would look at that. At some point, the real monkeys diverged away from what we know as the apes, right? Based on, right, the apes have more erect posture. They have no tail, right? If you think about all the great apes, including us, we don't have a tail, right? Well, we all have a little tiny tail, but you can't really see it. We have like 2 vertebrae and your tailbone, right? It doesn't show, but we have a little tiny stub, right? But monkeys have a regular tail, okay? And then as you move up, right, another divergence, right? Reduced hairiness, elongated skull, and enlarged brow bridge. So we're more related, right, if there's us, more related to the gorilla than to the orangutan. Okay. And then another deviation event, right? We had shortened canine, broad incisors, right, our regular front teeth. Delayed sexual maturity, so it takes us longer to grow up. Same with the chimpanzees, right? And an increase in the size of the genitalia. So the gorillas got left behind on that. That's probably why they're so angry. Okay. And so, right, another speciation event from the chimpanzee to the human beings, right? So we are the most similar to the chimpanzee or that other guy, right? So that was another speciation event from the line of the chimpanzee. Okay. So that's the most similar node for us to the chimpanzee. So we're the most similar on this planet to chimpanzees, right? In this, we're the least similar to the squirrel monkey because that's the event that was way down here. Okay? So we're the most homologous to the chimpanzee. Oh, it's just time for a little.
Oh, it's nice today. I think I might, was it Alan? Alan! Ow! Alan! Yeah, I don't think you can hear me, you know. Yeah. Alan! 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 Ow! Alan! 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 Oh, so that's not Alan. Steve, that's Steve. Steve! 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 Oh, no, that's not Steve. That is Alan. Alan! Alan! Ow! Alan! 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 Did someone just say my name? Hey! 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 You say Alan?
Aw, look at those guys. Aren't they cute? All right, let's top hat, people. Although I'm not really prepared, so let's try to make that happen. Towie. Towie! Get ready. Get your phones out. Okay, let's see. What do we have? Oh, there we go. Aha! So this one. Oh, that one needs to go away. No, that one's not going away. There we go.
If I were to do this online, I just go into the website?
I think so, yeah. And then your username and password. Okay. All right, let's look at this question. Okay, which of the following statements would be true of two species, so two different species, that have descended from the same common ancestor? At some point, right, they were on that, they're in the same tree, would be true. Oh, we didn't even talk about one of these, so. Whoa. So which one of these would be true if you have a common ancestor? And, yeah. And we didn't really talk about it, but remember when we were talking about those horses, if the line of the tree does not go to the present, that means they were extinct, they died, right? So the examples that we showed for both of these trees, everybody was still alive. Turtles and beavers and kind of stuff. But you can, like in the real tree of life, it lists all the ones that have been extinct also, and their lines just don't get to the top, to the present time. Texting. Did you get in? Did you get in a second? It worked? Okay, cool. Oh, we're almost done. Hurry! Ah! Does everybody's text go? No? Are you having service issues? No? It just won't go? Oh, it went? Everybody's good? All right, well, you can probably still send it anyways because, you know, this is kind of meaningless when you say disable. Whoa. All right, let's look at my report. Yay! Right, they don't have to still exist. The examples I gave did, so that was kind of unfair, sorry. That's why I said, remember the horse, some of those are dead. And the species are not identical. That's the whole definition of two different species, is they're not identical. Right? If you're within a species, you're still not identical unless you're an identical twin, right? An evil twin. And then convergent evolution we haven't even talked about yet. So who the hell put that? People. Okay, we're going to talk about that soon. So hold on to your undies. All right, does everybody's text go through? All right, I'm deactivating. Deactivate, I think. Is it really? Okay. All right, let's see how good you people are at remembering. Oh, Ellen. Okay, so if we are going to classify stuff, and as it turns out, scientists love classifying things and having names for stuff and listing them and doing Excel spreadsheets, right? That makes us happy. So how we keep track of all the different species on this planet so that we can talk about them, right? If you're studying something and you're comparing it to another species, you have to have something that makes sense to organize them, okay? And the classification scheme is based on their similarity between species, okay? So anything, the most similar organisms would be something in a population, right? They'd be the most similar to each other, right? But we don't include population on this list because that would be crazy, right? To try to have all the populations of everything, you know, name, like this is the Southern California, blah, blah, blah. So the most similar would be the species, right? Because those are the organisms that reproduce and have live, fertile offspring, right? Those are the guys that you're the same species. You're the most similar to each other. So you can think of as species as similar. And then as you move up this classification scheme, you get less and less similar to each other. But it gives you an idea of, just by looking at the tree or looking at the classification, how similar something is to another organism, right? So if you're a different species but in the same genus, you're pretty similar, right? So those stupid salamanders that were in that mountain, there was 4 different ones, right? They were the same genus but just different species. So pretty darn similar to each other, okay? And so the name of organisms, if you're looking at the real name, like our species name is Homo sapiens, okay? Sapiens is the species, Homo is the genus, right? Or if, like E. coli, that bacteria that gives you horrible diarrhea if you get the bad strain, right? You ate a bad strawberry and then you have explosive diarrhea, okay? So the real name E stands for Escherichia. That's the genus. And then coli is the species. Coli stands for colon because that's where it likes to live. Okay. But there's other species of coli. They're just a different genus, or sorry, different species of the Escherichia, right? Just not coli. So those bacteria are more similar to each other than like Staphylococcus aureus. That's the one that causes that MRSA flesh-eating bacteria. So Staphylococcus would be the genus. Aureus is the species. Right? There's other Staphylococcus. I can't think of what else it's called. But so those are more similar to each other than to the Escherichia. Okay? But they'd all be in the same family of gram-negative bacteria. Okay? So then family would be next, then order, class, phylum, kingdom, and domain is the big one. So this is the classification scheme from the most specific to the least, and we're going to do some examples of that. But I'm going to give you a little thing, I don't even know what they call it, to remember this order, because you're going to need to remember, right, if I say 2 things are in the same kingdom, are they more similar to 2 things that are in the same order? And if you don't know where these lie in that, okay, well, order is much more specific than kingdom, so order, they're more similar. But if you don't know this little scheme, then you can't answer that question. So the easiest way to remember it is, damn kinky people, come on for good sex. Yes, come on, I said kinky. One person remembered. Good job. Okay? So domain is sort of out there. We don't talk about it that much. So I would just remember, kinky people, come on for good sex. Woo! Okay? So when you get your exam, you just write that in the corner, right? K, P, C, O, F, G, S, and then you just answer those questions. Okay? Because it's really hard to remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Right? That's a lot harder to remember than what I said before that I won't say again. One more time. Now you guys are warmed up. Okay. All right, so here's our example for that. And so I think this will help us. And so these include the domain. So domain is like eukaryotic versus prokaryotic. Prokaryotic is bacteria. Okay, so those are 2 main domains. There's this other crazy organism called archaea that I don't care about. But as it turns out, they're very similar to bacteria, and a lot of those like to live in your colon, and those are the ones that give you really stinky gas. So you can just bring that up next time you have a little problem. Okay, so all of these are in the same domain, right? They're not bacteria. A human being's not a bacteria, a blue whale's not a bacteria, and a giant octopus is not a bacteria. All in the same domain. They're all animals. So the kingdoms are plants, animals, fungus, and some other crazy stuff. Okay, so they're all animals. So they're in the same kingdom. So a human being is more similar to a blue whale than to a tree. Because a tree's a plant, that's not the same kingdom. Okay? The phyla is chordata. Okay, that is the vertebrates. That's your nodal cord. Okay, so human beings have a spine, and blue whales have a spine, but the giant octopus does not. Right? It doesn't have bones, has no spine. So we are more similar to a blue whale than we are to a giant octopus. Okay? And then the class, humans and blue whales are both mammals. Right? The giant octopus is a cephalopod. Okay? So mammals, right? Fur and mammary glands. Blue whales don't really have fur, but they do have hair like whiskers, so that counts as hair. And they do have hair follicles that just don't make hair anymore. And then their order, human beings are primates. The blue whale is a cetacea, so that's where we differ. Okay? And then the family for human beings is the hominids. Our genus is Homo, our species is Sapiens. Okay? So other whales that have the baleen, which are those big, they're teeth-like things. They look more like hairs where they get the krill and then they, strain it out. So all the whales that have that kind of teeth, right, are generally within this family. And then the ones that are very similar to each other are in the same genus, and then their species just differs. Okay. So if we had another organism listed, right, if we had the monkey, then the monkey would still be the same order as us, would be a primate, but it would not be a hominid. Okay? And I think our book gives us some examples of other, comparisons. So if you're looking at something, I have to give you information. I don't expect you to memorize which order. I'd have to tell you, the human being and the blue whale are in the same class. They're both mammals. Okay. The human being and the giant octopus are in the same kingdom, Animalia. Which is more similar to humans, the blue whale or the giant octopus? And as long as you know kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and that species is the most specific and kinky, I'm so half-hearted, and is the least similar, then that question's an easy 2 points. If you don't know this, then that's a 1 in 4 chance of getting it right, if you guess, right? It's generally 4 options. It's 25% chance. That's not good. Okay. So how do we set these guys up in classification? A lot of it now is done by DNA sequencing because that's the best way to look at how similar something is. DNA doesn't lie, okay? But a lot of things historically were not sequenced. You can't necessarily, it's not, oh my God. It's my husband. No idea when I'm in class. Yeah, whatever. Okay, sorry. He can't keep track of my schedule. Can't keep track of his own children. I don't know what I'm talking about. Just totally lost. Okay. Okay, whatever. Oh, DNA. I love DNA. How could I forget about DNA? So it's expensive to do sequencing, and so not every species on the planet has been sequenced. And historically, until the last 10 or 20 years or so, it was not even feasible to do. Okay? So most things were looked at, we use comparative anatomy to look at different species to determine how similar they are, right? First, you can just do the biological sex test of any of them out there that are cooperative, right, to see if they're the same species. And then if they're not the same species, well, how do they fall on that stupid chart, right? So do they have a vertebra? Well, if they do, then you know that they're the chordata, right? So you can do some just big morphological stuff. And other comparative anatomy just means looking at parts of organisms that are pretty similar to each other to look how similar are they. And so if you look at the arm bones, like here's our human being, right? So this is us. And you compare that to the chimpanzee, it looks pretty darn similar. It's not exactly the same, right? But you really can't argue that we're related to the chimpanzee, right? That would be an enormous coincidence to end up having arm bones so incredibly similar to another organism on this planet, unless we had a common ancestor that we both evolved from, okay? And then even if you look at a lion, right, the color coding shows the different types of bones, all the same types, right? Different shape, evolved for running, right? Evolved for grabbing tools, okay? And then our good friend the sea lion, oh my gosh, look, it's all the same types of bones, evolved for swimming, right? Allowed them to have a greater reproductive survival advantage. If you have a flipper, if you live most of the time in the water, right, you can escape predators, right? The killer whale's favorite food is the sea lion and seals, okay? So you got to be able to swim fast. And then a bat, right? All the same bones, right, with the flappy skin between so they can fly. Evolved for better survival and reproduction of that species. But this is all homologous. These are the same bones shaped a little bit differently. Homologous structure, same structures, okay? Suggesting a recent common ancestor of all of these guys, right? And if you look at all of these guys and you know anything about them, they are all mammals. So we would expect them to have homology. Okay. We can also use comparative anatomy to look at things that we used to have. So here's the tailbone example, right? Anything that no longer serves a function but still exists is called vestigial. Okay, so a vestigial trait is something that we still have, but it doesn't really do anything, or we don't know what it does. It doesn't seem to give a survival advantage or disadvantage. Okay, so our tail would be a vestigial trait. We still have it, but it doesn't seem to do anything. But it suggests that our common ancestor had a tail, because we still have a little bit left of a tail. Okay, whales still have hip bones, where legs used to come out. They don't have legs anymore, but they still have that bone structure. Okay, same with snakes. They don't have legs, but they evolved from an ancestor that did, because they still have vestigial structures where legs would have been attached to the bone structure. Okay, those are all vestigial. So something like goosebumps would be considered vestigial in human beings. Right? Goosebumps in animals were used to fluff up their fur to either keep them warm or look bigger and scarier or whatever they needed. Right? We get goosebumps when we're cold, and we generally don't have enough hair for that to make any difference in keeping warm. Yet they didn't go away. So why didn't they go away if they're not useful to us? Through evolution. Anyone? Right? Remember when we talked about evolution? It's not striving for perfection. There's no, things don't go away unless they actually cause you to die. Right? So traits exist if they either give you survival advantage and reproductive advantage, or they're neutral. Because the only time traits aren't passed is if the person that had the trait is dead and doesn't pass that DNA. So the DNA for goosebumps just keeps continually being passed, right, through human beings because it's not selected against. It didn't cause reproductive inhibition. Now, if sometime in our past when we were cavemen and we lost most of our hair and we were running around nude, and somebody had goosebumps that were really pronounced, and nobody wants to have sex with that person, right? They only had sex with people with really small goosebumps. Then over time, those would have disappeared because anybody that had DNA for giant goosebumps would not get to have sex with anyone, right? They'd be sexually selected out of those populations, right? So that's same with any kind of phenotype. And if those traits aren't passed, then they wouldn't exist anymore, right? So obviously having that little stump of a tail did not inhibit anybody from survival or reproduction, so it stayed around. There's nothing to get rid of it, right? There's nothing to try to strive for perfection. It's just, if it doesn't hurt you, it sticks around. If it helps you, it sticks around. If it causes you to have decreased competition for survival and reproduction, then it ends up disappearing because those individuals that have those traits are dead and they don't pass them. Okay? But they're really helpful if you're this, that snow monkey guy that's always freezing and you fluff up your fur and that holds more air and it's better insulation. For us, it doesn't matter. Okay. And then we can look at in embryonic development, that's another way to look at homologies, right? If you're not a plant expert, I think all of us here are not plant experts, but we can see that a sunflower looks a lot different than that tree, a maple tree. Right? Morphologically, remember morphologically is just what they look like? They're not the same. They're both plants, right? You'd agree with me. But they don't look the same as adults. But if you look at their embryo or their seedlings, I would not be able to tell you which is which. I don't think any of us, that's definitely going to be a maple tree. Not a sunflower. Any stupid little plant is really difficult to, they all look the same. Right? Embryologically, they're very, very similar. Okay? For example, human being children, right? When we are a little embryo, this is probably, about 4 to 6 weeks, right? You can see we have a tail. Look at there's our little tail. It's so cute, right? You can see our spine. This is a pig embryo. Oh, look, it's got the same kind of spine. There's the arm buds and the leg buds. Oh, look, they look just like the human being ones. Just little paddles, right? We had gills. When we're an embryo, we have gills. We have gill slits. We don't have the actual gill. We have gill slits. Like, you know how sharks, you can see those slits right in the outside? We look like little sharks. So do pigs. Pretty much all embryos on this planet have those slits, suggesting we all evolved at one point from a gill-bearing organism way the hell back there, right? Before we crawled out of the water onto land. Okay? So embryos, right, if you showed us any of these between people, pigs, chickens, they all look the same. Okay? At least any of the embryos of the vertebrates, right? Because of that telltale spine and gills and limb buds and all that other stuff. Okay. And then, of course, DNA, right? That's the one. If you can get DNA sequence, you don't even need to bother doing any of the rest of it because you know how similar the species are. And so if we go back to our primates, right, we talked about the monkeys were the least similar according to all the other ways they were characterized. And then when we did the DNA analysis, yay, look, these are the least similar to human beings. So that classification scheme that was set up by morphology and embryology and all that stuff before DNA sequencing was available actually came true, right, for most things. Now, some things on the tree, the DNA, refuted how they were placed by species, and they've been moved around on the tree based on DNA evidence, okay? But you can see our most similar species is incredibly similar to us. 1% of our DNA is different from a chimpanzee, okay? That's not much, right? If you go to the zoo and you look at a chimpanzee's face, it really looks like my grandpa. Right? I mean, they're strikingly human looking in the face and the eyes if you really watch them. Strikingly. Okay? What makes them not a hominid, right, is what we're going to talk about in the next chapter. What defines that hominid, what that family of being a hominid versus just being, right, in the ape family. And so we'll talk about that too. And then biogeography is just where they are, and this is most used for fossils, right? We can't do DNA on fossils, right? Because fossils are rocks, unless you found like a mummy, which is actual tissue that's been preserved, or some frozen caveman lawyer or something that actually has tissue. You can't get DNA from a fossil. It's just a rock or an imprint. Right? But you can look at where were all these fossils found, in what layer of sediment, and put together, it's likely they were the same species. They're morphologically similar. They are found in similar strata, which means like at the same time frame, right? They were alive at the same time on this planet, right? And all the fossils were found in areas where the land masses were connected at that time. We'd guess they're probably the same species, okay? So biogeography is mostly used for stuff that's extinct. Because if it's out there and you really want to know, you just got to sequence it. Okay. And if they don't all agree and you can't get DNA, then whichever the most simple idea is where you jam them onto the stupid tree. Right? Whichever makes the most sense is the easiest explanation for where they fit. Right? But DNA sequence is where you can actually put them on the tree and be very confident with that. Okay. Then the last thing we're going to talk about during classification are organisms that tricked people, I guess, way back when. They're organisms that look very similar, so if you were doing everything except for the DNA, you might get confused as to where to put them on the tree, because they look extremely similar, but they're actually not very related. Okay, so if something looks similar but does not have a recent common ancestor, we call that looking similar convergent evolution. They've converged to look similar even though they started from organisms that were very different, okay, recently. Rather than regular evolution, right? You have a fork. This is your recent common ancestor. They each got a little different from each other. Convergent evolution is the opposite. They came from different parts of the tree, and they converged, right? To look very similar. So a really good example would be the cactus, which are the desert plants over here on this side of the hemisphere, and something they call the euphorbs, which are in the eastern hemisphere. So if you're in a desert, right, on this side of the world, you see lots of cactus. Cactus evolved to absorb lots of water and hold it, right? Deserts generally mean they don't get much water, and when they do, they get lots of it. So it just rains like hell for 2 days, and then it doesn't rain again for another 363 days. So those plants have to get all the water they can as fast as they can and store it for an entire year. Okay? And then they also have to protect that water from other things that need water. Everybody in the desert wants water, right? Because it rains twice 2 days, and that's it. So every animal out there wants to eat a cactus, right? Suck on a cactus, get the fluid out of it. So they evolve spines to help them survive. Same idea happened in the eastern side of the world in the desert areas. Different plant species that were not at all similar to the cactus ancestor, right? Wasn't always desert, right? The Fertile Crescent used to not be a desert. Now it's mostly desert. Desertification has happened over the last 5,000 years, okay? So any plants that are still living there had to evolve to survive, right? Those populations either adapted, right? Individuals had adaptations to get more water, and then those are the ones that reproduced, and then those guys were better at saving water, and blah, 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 or they were dead. There's no other option. Okay, you're either good at saving water or you're dead. So anything that wasn't good, we don't see anymore. Doesn't exist in those deserts. So these guys got good at storing water in their stems, similar to the cactus, and making spiny-like structures to protect them from all the other animals that want to come and eat chunks off of them. Okay? But they're not similar by DNA. They do not have a recent common ancestor. They came from two separate parts of that tree of the plants. They are not homologous. Okay? Homologous means they look similar, they have similar blah, 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 from a recent common ancestor. They diverged to be two separate species in homologous organisms through evolution, right? Start the same, get a little different. These guys start different, get the same looking. Converge to be very similar. Are you with me? Yes? In the exam, you're going to go, converge. Right? To remind you, they start different, and they get the same, like merging together, converging. Okay. So there's some other examples in your book for that also. So you can think about convergent evolution. A nice example would be like a dragonfly or any insect that flies and a bird. Is a dragonfly's wings anything like a bird wing? No, right? Not at all. They don't have a recent common ancestor. Yeah, we have a common ancestor with insects that goes way back, but not, right? Those two structures evolved completely separately on completely separate species, right? Their DNA, if you sequence a dragonfly and a bird, are completely different, yet they both have wings to fly. That would be a convergent structure between dragonfly and bird for the wings, right? Yes? Okay. So, right, if they're shared by common descent, they're similar in DNA sequence, they came from a recent common ancestor, we call them homologous. If they're not, we call them convergent. Oh, look at that. That's so cute. So there's a bony fish, like a regular old fish, and then a skate, which is like, you know, a stingray type guy related to the sharks, right? A cartilaginous fish, right? Sharks don't have real bones. They just have cartilage, kind of like the stuff in your ears, right? They're very wiggly, okay? They look very similar because of their environment, right? That guy lays on the bottom and then hides in the sand, and then when a fish comes by, oh, and eats it. Same with that guy. He just sits there, hides in the sand. A fish comes by, and he eats it. Okay. They converge to look. Their shape is similar, but they're two completely different types of organisms, right? Recent common ancestor from this guy is a fish somewhere. More recent common ancestor for that guy is more like the original shark type guys. Okay. Yeah, way back when, everybody on this planet has a common ancestor. But when we're trying to determine between homologous and convergent, it's a recent common ancestor, right? So all the flat fishes, real bony fishes, would have a recent common ancestor. They'd be homologous, right? That guy with a stingray, like the same shape, it's cartilaginous, its recent common ancestor was a shark. This guy to a stingray would be homologous. But these two guys together is convergent. Oh, let's watch a little video.
North American hummingbirds have evolved long, slender bills and tube-like tongues that dart into a flower's corolla for nectar. The bird's relationship to the plant is mutualistic. The hummingbird is fed, and the plant is pollinated. Unrelated species can develop similar characteristics when they are subjected to similar environmental selective pressures, such as a mutualistic relationship. Here, a Suimanga sunbird in Madagascar, unrelated to the hummingbird, has also evolved a long, slender beak for obtaining nectar from flowers with similar tube-shaped petals.
Riveting. Okay, so when I give you examples of this, I'll tell you something about them. Because I don't expect you to know that that stupid bird and a hummingbird are not similar, right? I wouldn't know that. So I will give you the setup. They do not have a recent common ancestor, yet they both have, you know, a pink tongue. What is this? Something like that, right? Or they do have a recent common ancestor. They both evolved from a mammal. What is that structure called? Homologous, Okay, so I won't just throw the name of a couple animals and expect you to know anything about them. Okay, unless they're a common animal like a turtle, right, and something else that lays eggs like a platypus, I don't know, right? And again, if I ever give an example and you don't know what the hell it is, just raise your hand and ask, okay? And that goes for any sort of vocabulary on the exams. I don't want you to get the answer wrong because you didn't understand the question, okay? I want you to, I was going to say, I want you to get it wrong because you just don't understand. I want you to get it right because you understand the concepts and blah, blah, blah. I don't want it to be because of something else outside of, like, the content of this class. Okay. Oh, look what time it is. Not again.
Oh, and this one time at band camp.
Yeah. Fascinating. All right. Oh, look what we have here. Little question about classification. So which is the best way, the one that we would use if we really want to know, that we didn't used to be able to do because it was too expensive, that you still can't do if you can't catch the stupid thing? But what is the definitive method to stick them on the tree in their spot that can refute the original placings of these organisms? What do I love the most? That I totally forgot what I was talking about on the phone ring. Just a few extra hints. The best way. Yeah. What? Oh. Yeah, we don't want that, right? If you start later, yeah. Yeah, what you said. Kinky! Wake up back there! I see you people sleeping. I can see you back there. I think you're hiding in the back row. It is really easy to see everybody in this room. Yeah, you guys thought you were hiding. I see you. All right. What the hell? Is everybody texting? It's going? It's going. That doesn't really work. Let's show our report. Yay! The best way, right? Yes, you can use embryonic development, right? But if you classified something based on that and then you sequence their DNA and it makes it fit someplace else on the tree, your DNA doesn't lie. That's where you go, okay? DNA sequence analysis is always the best way to determine relationships amongst species or within a species as well. Like, who's your daddy, right? You totally figure that out. So look at your DNA. Okay, good job, people. All right, what else? Oh my gosh, we're done with that. Oh good, we're done with Tuesday's lecture. Oh wait, it's Thursday. Sorry. Yeah, you guys thought you were going early. You know I use every second. I don't even let you out 10 seconds early. Come on. Get to know me. All right, so we're talking about being human. In this chapter, all about human evolution. Again, a hominid is, well, surprise, anybody in that family, okay, including any living and extinct human beings and apes. Because as it turns out, we're not the only humans that have ever lived on this planet. So we're going to talk about those guys. The humans and apes are grouped together because of fossil evidence, blah, 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 and because the DNA is so frickin' similar, right? Remember the chimp and the human being, 99% identical, right? We evolved from a common ancestor that we assume lived about 13 million years ago, right, where the hominids separated off from the apes. So here's our little tree, okay? So here's all, except for the Homo sapiens, are records from fossil evidence, okay? So again, down here, millions of years ago, 6 million years ago and beyond, so 13 million years ago down here, right? Our first ancestor was even a completely different genus than us, not Homo, right? This one was called Ardipithecus, which is very similar to Australopithecus. Okay, the very first hominids are generally defined by their fossil structure by how their hips look, right? The hips of a hominid look like the legs are standing upright, okay? Whereas the apes, right, the legs, they can't actually do this, right? They're like, their bones are stuck in that position. They cannot straighten up completely. So you can see monkeys, apes, chimpanzees, that when they stand up, their hip joint is still not straight. So you can tell in the fossil whether they were able to, tuck in the butt cheeks like that, right? Or if they were, meant to essentially walk on all fours and couldn't stand completely upright. Okay, so they look at the fossils of that, and because as it turns out, the skulls of these guys look very ape-like. Okay, and so if you only found a skull, it was very difficult to determine whether that was an ape, like an ancient chimpanzee or one of the other, a gorilla or something like that, versus a hominid. You had to be able to look at some of the hip joints. And then once you've had, some of that skeletal, then you found other skulls, and you can compare them to the skulls of one that stood upright to determine where they fit. And so if you know anything about Lucy, which was, she was Australopithecus, and her entire skeleton was found, and so that was one of the biggest findings, that she's very ape-like, yet stood completely upright, okay? And she had at least one offspring, they could tell from the way your bone structure is, and she was quite young. So they think she was in her teens. She was very young. And so that was the huge controversy. I don't know when that was, 30 years ago, the ape woman, and we're all coming from the apes, and then the planet of the apes, and all that kind of stuff, okay? Was she the missing link, and blah, blah, blah. So there's even more ancient fossils that have been found since then than that skeleton, but that's one of the most intact, complete skeletons of one of our ancestors, right? And she lived, 3.5 million years ago, okay? And then as you go up the tree, right, we see some other lines that died out. So Australopithecus, right, another species had died out. They think from Lucy's type, the evolutionary tree diverged, right? There was another, now we're up to the Homo habilis. This guy is in our same genus, so much more similar to us than what Lucy was, right? And then another branch went off, which was a dead-end genus and species of hominids, right, that died out, a million years ago or so. And then within the recent history, right, Homo sapiens, we can see the blue line is the present, so everybody who's below the blue line is dead and extinct. As you can see, only Homo sapiens, that's us, look at how good looking we are, right, there are still surviving, right. The Neanderthal is extinct, appeared to go extinct between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago, so was here relatively recently. Homo erectus was farther back. Homo habilis was farther back than that. Okay, the Neanderthals were a little bit shorter than us. They were a lot stronger than us, and they had bigger brains than us. They seem to be much better adapted to life on this planet than us. But we won. Okay. Sorry, Charlie. Okay. And then this is just another way of putting this from another book, showing you all the different types, and that, again, Australopithecus, right, very ape-like, and then as we go through evolution, becoming more and more human, right? Homo sapiens still surviving. There's a couple other. And so the argument of how all the different evolutionary branches went is still under a lot of investigation. Okay, so where all these guys are put on the tree and who exactly evolved from whom is still an argument, because we don't have DNA from most of these species, right? Again, a fossil skull is really rock. You can't get DNA out of a rock. Okay? There was a frozen individual that they think is Neanderthal, and they have been working on sequencing that DNA to see how similar it is to our DNA now. So we do know from the fossil record that both Homo sapiens and the Homo Neanderthal lived in the same areas at the same time. Okay? And so it's been suggested that the Neanderthal species did not go extinct, but they assimilated, right? And that the two cultures intermixed, and what we have left today is mostly Homo sapien DNA with some inner hybridization with the Neanderthal. So they're doing all these sequencing projects to determine if they think they had sex together or not. Okay. If you want to read some science fiction, you can read Clan of the Cave Bears, because that's all about early hominids, right? The Neanderthal versus Homo sapiens. And in that book, they totally intermixed. And you know, I'm sure that's true, because that's scientific evidence in somebody's fictional book. Okay. So if you care about Neanderthal sex, go read that book. Okay, so then what else is here, right? The humans and the chimps most closely related, whatever, since their ancestor both lived, blah, 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 right? Lots of evolutionary change, but again, if you go look at the chimps, they still look a lot like my grandpa. So the ability to walk upright based on the shape of our hips, right? They assume made us more free to use and make tools, the advanced bigger brain, and also the forebrain. So if you go back and look at those pictures, even the Neanderthal forehead was very sloped, right? They didn't have that frontal lobe that the Homo sapiens did. This is, they think, mostly in charge of reason and creative activities and the ability to plan and solve problems, right? And so they might have had a bigger brain, but we had a better part of the brain. We were smarter about solving problems, which could include ways to hunt better without dying, right? Getting better food, better shelter, all sorts of things. And a complex language to communicate so that if you're doing complex social behaviors, there's some way to talk to each other. They don't think Neanderthals had much speech communication based on how the structures of their throat was compared to ours, and compared to apes that don't speak. Okay, so if two populations become isolated, right, and we don't have much gene flow, they can speciate. And so the question remains, so what is a race? And so obviously, if you're a different race or a different breed, right, we talk about dogs, all the different breeds of dog, yet they're still the same species, right? How different can these be? And is race that we talk about with human beings really on the road to speciation or not, right? So the definition of biological race, some consistent differences between different populations. Right, so two different races of dragonfly look very similar. Oh, look at that cute guy. Those guys, very different, okay? So we would identify those dogs as being two different breeds, right, or two different races. Even though they're still the same species, right, because you can do the sex test. That would be interesting. Okay, so how do we look at human races? We can look at evolutionary history. Where did we all come from? And then differences and similarities. And now we can look at DNA, right? DNA sequence analysis to determine if certain groups, or what are classified as races now, really are that different from other groups. And so most of the evidence right now suggests that race is based on social, but not biological factors. So races that seem very different when we do DNA analysis are not very different at all. So one of the biggest indicators, or one of the biggest things that makes people look different morphologically, would be skin color, right? It's very different for somebody who's very pasty versus somebody who's very dark. And it's a very small change in, again, it's a pigment. It's the ability to make that pigment and how much of it. Okay, so the lighter skinned you are, the less of that pigment you make, right? The darker skinned you are, the more of that pigment you make, right? And that's a very small DNA difference between those that make a lot of pigment and not much at all. Makes a huge phenotypical difference, but DNA sequence-wise, not very different at all. Okay? So that skin color determining race, at least by DNA sequence analysis, totally doesn't stand up at all. Okay? It's just all, it's a very small base pair change, and they think it makes sense that it was an adaptation for the regions that those people moved into to live in. Okay, so blah, 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 that's just what I said. So what we found is that we can, every single person on this planet can essentially trace our common ancestor back to one single woman. So apparently she was this superwoman whose offspring survived to reproduce better than everybody else, and everybody else has ended up dying off. Lived in Eastern Africa, about 200,000 years ago. Okay. We call her Mitochondrial Eve because we can track DNA from mother to offspring by the specific type of DNA that's in one of the organelles that we'll talk about later. You guys don't really have to know. But you only get that DNA from your mom. You almost never get any of that DNA from your dad. So your general genome DNA, half is mom, half is dad. Then you get this little bit that's different from that just from the egg. Right? The sperm really is just some regular chromosomes and a membrane, but the egg has all the other stuff, and it contains some other types of DNA. So you only get that from mom. So you can trace back by that DNA sort of a maternal family tree. Okay, so this is a little example of that. I'm not going to ask you guys anything detailed about mitochondrial DNA, but it does support that human beings evolved in Africa and moved from there to every place else on this planet. Where are you people going? Sit on it. Huh? I see 2 minutes. What do you see? Yeah, I got my 2 minutes, people. My 15 minutes in the sun. Okay. Okay, so they track that through that mitochondrial DNA, suggesting all the people that live on this planet originally came from Africa, right? That's where hominid evolution happened. And so they can look at all of that and trace it back, and they can find, the dead-end relatives, whatever. The book goes into all kinds of details with that. I'm not going to ask you a lot of details about that at all, but it really is an interesting story to read. But the most important thing from this is that evolution started in Africa and then moved in waves to all the different parts of the world. And we can track the skin color of all these different populations based on how close they are to the equator. So if your relatives, if your ancestors evolved near the equator, where it's always very sunny and there's lots of UV irradiation, you have dark skin because that protects you from the sun. It's a built-in sunscreen. If you live farthest north or south from the equator, your skin would be very light because you don't need that sunscreen from the sunlight, but you do need to absorb more UV light to make vitamin D. Okay? And so I will now let you guys go, and we will continue this on Tuesday. All this stuff is going to be in the quiz. Okay, so make sure you read through this chapter and the rest of this lecture Because there will be a couple questions based on UV and sunlight and all that kind of crap. Because we're a little behind. Zowie.